He wasn't supposed to touch the chalkboard. He was only there to clean it. But when the Harvard professor walked in, he froze at the sight. The black janitor, Malcolm, solving equations that his brightest PhD students had failed for years. Instead of applause, Malcolm was accused of stealing, lying, and trespassing into brilliance he wasn't allowed to own. In just one moment, his entire future would depend on a single question: would the world see a genius or erase him again? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The corridors of Harvard at night held a silence different from the daytime hum of ambition. By day, the air was filled with sharp voices, hurried footsteps, and laughter tinged with privilege. But by night, when the students had retreated to their dormitories, and the faculty to their polished brownstones, the marble hallways echoed with a quieter rhythm: the soft swish of a mop, the rattle of a cart, the squeak of rubber soles against waxed floors. This was Malcolm Reed's time. At 43, Malcolm had spent nearly 2 decades pushing a broom, scrubbing toilets, and collecting clutch in buildings that smelled faintly of chalk dust and coffee. To most of Harvard, he was invisible. Students brushed past him without eye contact, professors nodded at him absently, and administrators treated him as part of the background, a necessary fixture like the vending machines or fire extinguishers. But Malcolm had a secret. When the classrooms emptied and the campus quieted, he would sometimes pause in front of the blackboards, still filled with half-erased equations, diagrams, and fragments of thought, left behind by students who assumed no one else cared to see them. Where others saw chalk scrawls, Malcolm saw patterns. He saw rhythm in the symbols, melodies in the curves of Greek letters, and meaning in the spaces left unfinished. Mathematics had been his first love. Long before his life narrowed into mops and buckets, he had once sat in high school classrooms, the only black kid in the advanced math program, scribbling equations faster than his teacher could write them. He had dreamed of scholarships, competitions, even teaching. But the dream collapsed under the weight of poverty and a system that never expected brilliance from him. His father's sudden death forced him into work at 17. College slipped out of reach. Now, Harvard's brilliance surrounded him, taunting him nightly. He wasn't bitter, at least not always. But he carried something no one suspected: a restless mind that never stopped solving. On a particularly cold January evening, when the snow outside made the campus glow under street lamps, Malcolm wheeled his cart into an empty classroom in the science building. His shift was long, but something about this room always drew him back. The chalkboards stretched from wall to wall, filled with notations from advanced mathematics courses. Most nights, he'd wipe them clean in silence. But tonight, he hesitated. He stared at the equations, dense, tangled lines of thought. One caught his attention: a half-solved derivation in the top corner of the board. He knew the problem. He had seen versions of it before. His heart picked up. He glanced at the door, empty, silent. Slowly, as if stealing something forbidden, Malcolm picked up a piece of chalk. His fingers trembled, not from fear of being caught, but from the thrill of possibility. The first line came easily, then another, then another. Symbols flowed from him as if he were pouring out a language he hadn't spoken aloud in years. His body leaned into the board, his breathing steady. The mop bucket sat forgotten in the corner. The cart untouched. He worked through the derivations step by step, erasing, rewriting, refining. His mind lit up, alive in a way it hadn't been for years. In that moment, Malcolm Reed was not a janitor. He was a mathematician. The chalk squeaked across the board, leaving behind trails of genius. He solved what the students hadn't, what perhaps even the professor hadn't expected them to. His eyes gleamed with focus. But as the door creaked open, Malcolm didn't hear it. Professor Elliot Granger had returned unexpectedly. Known among students as brilliant but cold, Elliot carried himself with the self-assuredness of a man who had long believed intellect was his birthright. He had forgotten his leather satchel in the classroom earlier, and had come back to retrieve it. He didn't expect to see anyone inside, certainly not a janitor standing at the chalkboard, scribbling furiously. Elliot froze. The sight before him was jarring. Malcolm, sleeves rolled up, stood in front of the sprawling board, covered with precise, elegant mathematical solutions. For a moment, Elliot couldn't breathe. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Was this some cruel joke? Was the janitor copying notes, scribbling nonsense? But then, he leaned closer. The symbols weren't random. They were advanced. Shockingly advanced. Lines that Elliot himself had wrestled with in his research appeared on the board, connected in ways that revealed both fluency and originality. This wasn't mimicry. This was mastery. A flicker of anger rose in him, as if the scene violated some natural order. Harvard classrooms belonged to the chosen, not to the unseen workers who cleaned them. Yet Eliot's rational mind recognized what his pride resisted. The janitor wasn't just doodling. He was solving, and solving well. Malcolm, still unaware of the professor's presence, stepped back to look at the board, chalk dust on his fingertips. A small, satisfied smile tugged at his lips. It was the kind of smile a man wore when the world was locked out, when he allowed himself to be what he was born to be. Eliot's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but no words came. Finally, the squeak of the professor's shoes on the floor cut through the silence. Malcolm's head jerked around. His eyes widened. He froze, chalk still in his hand. For a long moment, neither man moved. Malcolm's stomach dropped. In an instant, he imagined the reprimands, the accusations. He was not supposed to touch the chalkboard, let alone write on it. He had violated the unspoken rule of invisibility. "Mr. Reed," Eliot said finally, his voice low, laced with disbelief. "What are you doing?" Malcolm opened his mouth but no sound came. His hand twitched, still holding the chalk like evidence of a crime. He looked at the board, then back at the professor. His lips parted again, but he couldn't bring himself to explain. Years of dismissal of knowing no one would believe him, pressed against his chest. The silence stretched, heavy with tension. Eliot stepped closer, eyes scanning the work on the board. His frown deepened, not in dismissal, but in shock. Every line was correct. More than correct. It was elegant. It was the kind of solution that revealed, not just training, but a rare instinctive genius. "Who taught you this?" Eliot demanded, his voice sharp now, cutting through the stillness. Malcolm's pulse thundered. "No one," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "I just see it." The professor blinked. His chest rose and fell, wrestling between disbelief and awe. The janitor's tone was unshaken, but the weight of centuries of prejudice pressed on Eliot's perception. Could it be possible? A janitor, a man dismissed daily, carrying knowledge that rivaled Harvard's finest minds. Eliot's jaw tightened. "You're telling me you did this on your own?" Malcolm lowered the chalk slowly, placing it back in the tray. He didn't answer, but his silence carried more defiance than words could. Eliot's gaze hardened. He wanted to dismiss it, to laugh it off as coincidence, as mimicry. But the board betrayed him. It stood there as undeniable proof. The professor's mind raced. He should report this. He should demand answers. But another part of him, the buried part that once cared about truth more than reputation, whispered a different thought. What if the janitor really was what he appeared to be? The classroom air thickened. Snow tapped against the window panes. The faint hum of the radiator filled the silence. Malcolm waited for judgment, his shoulders tense, his heart pounding. Eliot took another step forward, his eyes never leaving the board. And in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, because what came next would not just decide Malcolm's fate. It would test the very walls of Harvard itself. But one winter night, as a professor unlocked his classroom, he froze at the sight of Malcolm bent over the board, filling it with lines of mathematics no student could explain. Before Harvard's marble corridors and chalk-filled classrooms, before the quiet solitude of night shifts that gave him stolen minutes with equations, Malcolm Reed had lived in a world that rarely gave him space to breathe, let alone dream. His earliest memories of numbers weren't in a classroom but in a cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago. His mother worked long shifts as a nurse's aide, her hands rough and her back bent from years of lifting patients who outweighed her. His father was a mechanic, brilliant in his own right, able to rebuild an engine from scratch with only half the tools he needed. Their home was small, but Malcolm filled it with scrap paper, receipts, grocery bags, old envelopes, anything that could hold the clusters of numbers he loved to scribble. By 8 years old, he had memorized multiplication tables that his teachers hadn't introduced. By 10, he was solving puzzles that made adults shake their heads in disbelief. But disbelief wasn't always admiration. Sometimes it was suspicion, the kind of sideways glance that said, "You must have cheated. You couldn't have figured that out on your own." School was supposed to nurture him. Instead, it became the place that taught him the weight of being overlooked. When he raised his hand in math class, his teacher often called on someone else. When he solved problems quickly, the teacher accused him of copying. "Let's see how well you do without looking at your neighbor's work." Malcolm, the teacher had said once, his voice carrying a cold edge. The class laughed. He had done the problem perfectly anyway, but the laughter stayed. The truth was, his brilliance was not invisible. It was uncomfortable. It challenged the quiet prejudice that believed children like him were supposed to struggle, not soar. And so, rather than lift him, the system clipped his wings. High school was worse. By then Malcolm's father had passed away from a sudden stroke. The man who had once told him, "Numbers are your gift, son. Don't ever let them take it from you," was gone, leaving Malcolm to shoulder the grief of being both eldest son and man of the house. The guidance counselor called him in one afternoon. "Malcolm," she said, her smile thin, "college might not be the right path for you. You were practical. You should look into trades. Something steady, something realistic." Realistic. That word carved deep into him. But he didn't fight. He didn't argue. Years of rejection had already taught him the cost of speaking up. He lowered his eyes and nodded. Even though inside him, numbers burned like fire, equations danced like constellations he longed to map. By senior year, with bills mounting and his mother exhausted, Malcolm dropped out to work. First at a grocery store, then at a factory, and eventually, years later, through a job placement program, he found work as a custodian at Harvard University. The irony was cruel. Here he was, sweeping the very floors of the institution that would never have admitted him, emptying the trash of students who took for granted the privilege of sitting in those lecture halls. Every night, he cleaned after their brilliance, their opportunities, their casual entitlement, and yet in the solitude of those classrooms, he stole small pieces of his dream back, chalk against the board, equations whispered like prayers. But invisibility carried its own weight. At Harvard, he was rarely spoken to except when someone needed a floor cleaned more quickly or a spill wiped up. Students avoided eye contact. Professors spoke past him as if he were deaf. Malcolm learned to blend into the background so well that sometimes, even he forgot he existed. Until that night, the chalk had betrayed him, or perhaps it had set him free. When Professor Elliot Granger stepped into the room and caught him mid-equation, all the years of silence, rejection and being unseen rushed back like a tidal wave. Malcolm's chest tightened. His hands, dusted with chalk, felt like evidence of a crime. He expected anger, maybe even humiliation. He expected to be told to put the chalk down and remember his place. He had seen it before, the way professors spoke when they thought he had crossed invisible lines. Yet beneath the professor's sharp questions, "Who taught you this? You're telling me you did this on your own?" Malcolm heard something else. A crack in certainty, a sliver of recognition. But recognition was dangerous. He knew enough history, enough of life to understand that brilliance was not always rewarded when it came from men like him. Recognition could quickly twist into suspicion, and suspicion into punishment. As Malcolm stood there in silence, heart pounding, he remembered being 14, solving a problem in class faster than the teacher. That same look of disbelief had crossed the teacher's face then too, just before accusing him of cheating. He remembered being 17, told college wasn't realistic. He remembered walking past Harvard's gates years ago, wondering what it must feel like to belong inside. And now, even here, in this fragile moment where the truth of his genius hung in the air, Malcolm felt the old doubt return. Would the professor see him, or see only a janitor pretending to be what he could never be? The weight of a forgotten life pressed down on him. The room felt smaller, the chalkboard taller, the silence unbearable. Elliot's eyes never left the equations, but his jaw clenched tighter with each passing second. Malcolm couldn't tell if the man was astonished or offended, inspired or enraged. For Malcolm, it was all too familiar. Every triumph in his life had been followed by dismissal. Every spark of brilliance had been dimmed by someone else's disbelief. He wanted to believe this moment was different. But deep down, a whisper of doubt coiled in his chest. What if nothing changes? What if even here, even now, they refuse to see me? The professor finally spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost to himself. This can't be right." Malcolm's throat tightened. The board stood as proof, yet even proof was not always enough. He knew that better than anyone. As the snow thickened outside, silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. And in that silence, one thought consumed Malcolm Reed. Not whether he had solved the problem, but whether the man standing before him would bury that truth, or set it free. And now, even as he solved problems students could not, A whisper of doubt lingered. What would the professor do with this discovery? Professor Elliot Granger had spent 20 years at Harvard, and in that time he had learned to measure intellect the way a jeweler measures diamonds, by pedigree, by polish, by provenance. To him, brilliance had a certain look, a certain sound, a certain kind of face. It wore blazers and spoke with confidence. It quoted obscure theorems at dinner parties and cited research in footnotes. It did not wear a janitor's uniform. And yet here he stood, staring at the blackboard, where Malcolm Reed had just written equations that shimmered with clarity. The lines were not guesses or mimicry. They were solutions. Solutions elegant enough to humiliate half his graduate students. Elliot's eyes narrowed. His mind scrambled for explanations. Could he have memorized this? Overheard it from a lecture? Copied it from discarded notes? But the rhythm of the equations betrayed something deeper. This wasn't mimicry. It was thought. Original thought. Elliot's pulse ticked at his temple. His world was not built to make sense of this moment. Harvard was a cathedral of order, where intellect trickled down through hierarchy. Students earned their place, faculty guarded it, and the custodial staff simply cleaned up after it. To see a man in coveralls scrawling mathematics like a savant, it bent the natural order. Where did you see this? Elliot asked sharply, breaking the suffocating silence. Malcolm's eyes flicked toward him, then back to the board. His voice was quiet, but steady. I didn't see it. I worked it. Elliot let out a short, humorless laugh. Worked it? His tone dripped with disbelief. Mr. Reed, this equation, this isn't high school algebra. This is graduate-level number theory. People spend years just building the foundation to attempt this. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Elliot stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing on the tile. You expect me to believe you? A janitor solved this? The word janitor lingered in the air like smoke, stinging more than the tone itself. Malcolm didn't flinch, though inside, the familiar ache of dismissal pressed against his chest. You asked what I was doing, he said quietly. That's the answer. I was solving. Elliot's eyes searched his face. He wanted to find a crack, some sign of bluff, of fraud, but there was only calm resolve, and that unsettled him even more. He turned abruptly to the board, scanning the work. Each step was precise. Each leap made sense. He hated to admit it, but the man's logic was airtight. It was not possible, and yet it was undeniable. Elliot folded his arms, pacing slowly. Do you realize what you've written here? Malcolm hesitated. He never boasted, never flaunted, but he also knew he couldn't shrink now. I realize it's clean, he said finally, and I realize your students left it unfinished. The words struck Elliot harder than expected. There was no arrogance in Malcolm's tone, only truth. But truth spoken from the wrong mouth was still a threat. For years, Elliot had built his reputation on the authority of being the smartest man in the room. Now, standing across from someone Harvard didn't even consider worthy of admission. He felt the foundation shift beneath him. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. You understand, of course, how unbelievable this looks. Malcolm's response was calm, almost weary. I've lived my whole life not being believed, Professor. That sentence hung heavier than the snow outside. Elliot turned away, running a hand over his jaw. He needed control of this moment. He needed to re-establish order, because if what he saw was true, then Harvard itself, its hierarchy, its gatekeeping, its quiet exclusion, would be exposed as a fraud. So he did what Harvard had always done. When confronted with the unexpected, he decided to test. Fine, Elliot said at last, his voice crisp. If you claim this is your work, then let's see what happens when you're given something fresh. No time to copy, no chance to memorize. Malcolm's brow furrowed. A test? Call it a demonstration. Elliot reached into his satchel, pulling out a notebook. He flipped it open to a page filled with scribbled half-solutions, notes on a problem he had been wrestling with for months. An unsolved problem, one he had thrown at his doctoral students as a challenge, knowing they would fail. He tapped the page. Work this. Malcolm studied the symbols. His eyes narrowed, scanning, processing, seeing the threads where others saw only knots. His fingers itched for the chalk, but he also felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about worth, about permission to exist as more than what the world had already decided for him. He reached for the chalk slowly, his hand brushing the tray. You're asking me to solve your work. I'm asking you to prove you're not lying, Elliot snapped. The bite in his tone wasn't lost on Malcolm. He nodded once, turning to the board. He blocked out the tension, the gaze burning into his back, the decades of dismissal echoing in his ears. He let the numbers speak instead. Step by step, the solution began to take form. His strokes were deliberate, his breathing steady, symbols cascaded like a language he had always known. Elliot's heart thudded in his chest as he watched. It was impossible, and yet it was happening right in front of him. Minutes stretched. The board filled with logic so crisp, so fluid. Elliot felt the ground tilt beneath him. He had given Malcolm an unsolved riddle, and the janitor was unraveling it with terrifying ease. Finally, Malcolm stepped back. The chalk hung loosely from his fingers. His work was not just correct, it was beautiful. Elliot's throat was dry. He searched for words, but none came. Malcolm turned, his expression unreadable. Will that be enough? The silence between them was thunderous. Elliot swallowed hard, his mind a storm. Part of him wanted to praise, to admit awe. Another part wanted to dismiss, to crush the possibility before it spread. Because if this man, this janitor, could do what even Harvard's finest struggled with, what did that say about the world Elliot had built his life upon? And then, as the weight of it threatened to collapse him, a new thought entered. A dangerous, tempting thought. What if he didn't tell anyone? What if he took Malcolm's work for himself? The idea slithered through his mind. It was outrageous, unethical. But it was also possible. Who would believe Malcolm Reed, the janitor? Who would believe a man whose life had been spent unseen? Elliot could bury this brilliance and wear it as his own, and no one would question it. The temptation scared him more than the equations. Malcolm's voice broke the silence. So, what happens now? Elliot looked at him, the conflict sharp in his eyes. Recognition battled arrogance, awe battled fear. He knew the next words out of his mouth would define everything that followed. And with a single decision, Elliot prepared to test Malcolm in a way that would expose not just the man, but the university's own prejudice. With a single decision, Elliot prepared to test Malcolm in a way that would expose not just the man, but the university's own prejudice. The classroom was still, except for the faint whistle of the radiator and the muffled hush of snow outside against the window panes. Inside, the air was thick with a tension that neither man could name. Elliot Granger stood with his arms folded, watching as Malcolm Reed, the janitor who had shattered his assumptions in a matter of minutes, held a piece of chalk like a soldier might hold a weapon. For Elliot, the test he was about to administer was not about curiosity. It was about control. He had spent years watching his doctoral students crumble under this very problem, their brows furrowed, their confidence collapsing, until they gave up or begged for hints. Now he wanted to see if Malcolm would collapse too. Write it out, Elliot said, his tone sharp, rehearsed, the same tone he used to pin students against their own inadequacy. Malcolm faced the board. The symbols in Elliot's notebook swirled in his mind, already beginning to connect. For him, mathematics wasn't just calculation. It was music, rhythm, structure, and poetry. Each line felt like a verse, each symbol like a chord, and as he placed chalk to board, the silence of the room shifted, becoming alive with thought. The first few lines came quickly, confidently. His shoulders relaxed as the structure revealed itself. The longer he wrote, the more his hand moved with precision. His breathing steadied. It was as if the board itself was waiting for him, as if these symbols had always been his to uncover. Behind him, Elliot's eyes tracked every movement. He had seen students fake understanding before. He had seen them bluff, scribble nonsense, and pray for validation. But this was different. There was no hesitation, no floundering. Malcolm's chalk strokes carried intention, each line tethered to the next with clarity. Minutes stretched into a half hour. Elliot found himself leaning against the desk, silent. At first he had been ready to pounce on any misstep, to ridicule any mistake, but there were none. What unsettled him most was not Malcolm's accuracy. It was his elegance. His work was not mechanical, it was beautiful. And that beauty threatened everything Elliot thought he knew about order, privilege, and belonging. Finally, Malcolm set the chalk down, his hand dusted white. He stepped back and exhaled, gazing at the board as though seeing an old friend. "It's there," he said quietly, more to himself than to Elliot. The professor moved forward, his polished shoes clapping against the tile. He scanned the board line by line. Each step was correct, each leap justified. Malcolm hadn't just solved the problem. He had illuminated it, made it cleaner, sharper, more complete than Elliot himself had ever managed. Elliot's heart hammered against his ribs, not from admiration, from fear. Because in that instant, he realized something chilling. If this man's work ever reached beyond these walls, it would expose Harvard's hypocrisy. It would reveal that brilliance did not belong exclusively to those anointed by wealth, pedigree, or skin color. It would prove that a man they had forced into invisibility was more gifted than the students and professors who walked these halls with pride. Elliot's throat tightened. The foundation of his identity, his authority as a gatekeeper of genius, suddenly felt fragile. "You understand," Elliot said slowly, forcing his voice to remain composed, "that what you've done here, no one will believe it." Malcolm turned, his face calm but resolute. "That doesn't change the fact that it's true." The simplicity of his words cut deeper than any argument. Elliot pressed his lips together. He wanted to argue, to dismiss, to laugh it off. But the truth glared back at him, in chalk. And then unexpectedly something stirred in him. A flicker of envy. Yes, but also a darker thought. What if I never tell anyone? The idea had crept in earlier, but now it pressed harder. If Elliot claimed the solution as his own, no one would question it. A janitor's word against a tenured professor's. It would be no contest. He could bury Malcolm's brilliance and wear it like a crown. The thought horrified him, and yet it tempted him. Malcolm, unaware of the storm raging in Elliot's mind, broke the silence. "You wanted proof. Now you have it." Elliot's eyes flicked to him, hard and unreadable. "Proof, yes," he said slowly. "But proof is meaningless if the world refuses to see the source." Malcolm tilted his head, studying him. "And the question isn't about me," he said. "It's about you. What do you do with it now?" The words landed like a challenge. For a brief, fleeting moment, Elliot felt the weight of his own moral crossroad. And then the unexpected twist. A sound echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Elliot's head snapped toward the door, just as it creaked open. Standing there was Samantha Cole, one of his doctoral students, clutching a notebook. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. The janitor, the chalk-filled board, the professor standing frozen. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. Elliot's stomach dropped. If she had arrived 2 minutes earlier, she might have seen Malcolm mid-solution. But now, she saw only the finished board. Her gaze lingered on the equations, her brow furrowing in astonishment. "Professor, who did this?" The room felt suddenly suffocating. Malcolm remained silent, his eyes shifting to Elliot. For the first time in his life, someone else might speak the truth, or erase it entirely. Elliot cleared his throat, his mind racing. This was his moment to decide. Did he give Malcolm credit, risking scandal, upheaval, and the wrath of a university unwilling to see a janitor as a genius? Or did he protect the fragile hierarchy by burying Malcolm's brilliance and wearing it himself? His heartbeat thundered. The choice clawed at him. And as Samantha waited for his answer, Elliot felt his world tilt into dangerous, irreversible. When Malcolm finished, Elliot's heart pounded, not from admiration, but from fear of what this meant for the fragile hierarchy he lived by. Samantha Cole stood frozen in the doorway, her gaze moving between the chalkboard and Professor Elliot Granger. The equations shimmered in the dim classroom light, each line precise, elegant, nothing like the sloppy attempts she'd seen from her peers. She knew the work immediately. This wasn't the scratch of a desperate student. This was the stroke of genius. "Professor," she said slowly, "who did this?" Elliot's throat tightened. He could feel Malcolm's eyes on him, steady, unblinking, waiting to see whether he would speak the truth or bury it. 1,000 thoughts raced through Elliot's mind. The risk of scandal, the danger of his own reputation, the collapse of Harvard's carefully curated hierarchy. He forced a thin smile. "It's something I've been working on," he said at last. His voice was measured, controlled, but his palms sweated. Samantha frowned. She'd been his student long enough to know his style, his mathematical voice. And what she saw on the board wasn't Elliot's. It was sharper, freer, unburdened by the ego that often colored his work. She opened her mouth to press further but stopped when she noticed Malcolm standing silently in the corner, chalk dust on his fingers. Their eyes met briefly. In that moment, Samantha understood. She didn't speak, not yet, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, she returned to her dorm restless, replaying the scene in her head. By morning, whispers began to trickle among the graduate students. Someone had seen her slip out of the science building late, her expression shaken, Others noticed Malcolm lingering in classrooms more than usual. Soon, rumor twisted rumor. The janitor had been caught doing something strange at the blackboard. At first it sounded like gossip too absurd to be true. A janitor solving equations? Impossible. But the more it was denied, the more it spread. By the end of the week, the story had seeped into the faculty lounge. Elliot overheard two professors murmuring over coffee. "They say Granger found him at the chalkboard," one whispered. "Working equations no one else could finish." The other scoffed. "Absurd. A janitor? Next they'll be telling us the cafeteria staff is writing dissertations." They laughed, but their voices carried unease. At Harvard, prestige was a currency more delicate than glass. Anything that threatened it, even a rumor, was dangerous. Elliot sat in silence, his face unreadable as he stirred his coffee. He wanted to dismiss it, to remind them the story was beneath their notice. But he didn't. His silence was enough to keep the rumor alive. Meanwhile, Malcolm felt the shift in the air. Students who had once brushed past him without a glance now eyed him with curiosity or contempt. Some whispered and pointed when he walked down the hall. Others smirked openly. One evening, while emptying trash in a lecture hall, he overheard two undergraduates. "They say he's some kind of savant," one said, laughing, "like a janitor genius." The other sneered. "Please, if he was that smart he wouldn't be cleaning toilets. He probably memorized something he saw on the board." People are gullible. The words stung, but Malcolm kept his head down. He had lived long enough to know that genius, when it came in the wrong skin, was always called a trick. But the whispers refused to die. In the faculty lounge, a younger professor, Dr. Patel, leaned across to Elliot one afternoon. "Tell me honestly, was it true? Did Reed really solve one of your problems?" Elliot's jaw tightened. "Rumors," he said flatly. "Nothing more." Patel studied him carefully. "If it was true, it would be remarkable." "Remarkable?" Elliot snapped. "It would be dangerous. Do you know what it would mean if a janitor outperformed our PhD candidates? Do you understand the headlines? The scrutiny?" Patel's brows rose. "So it is true." Elliot froze. His own words had betrayed him. That night he drank more than usual, staring at the ceiling of his Cambridge townhouse. He told himself he had done the right thing. He had preserved order, protected the university. But deep inside he knew the truth. He was afraid not just of Malcolm's brilliance, but of what it revealed about his own limitations. And then the unexpected twist. A week later, Samantha handed in her research proposal. Tucked between the pages was something Elliot hadn't expected. Photocopies of equations, written in Malcolm's unmistakable hand. She had found them crumpled in a trash bin near one of the classrooms. Unlike the board, these notes bore no professor's fingerprints. No plausible deniability. They were Malcolm's alone. Elliot stared at the papers, his chest tightening. They were extraordinary. The kind of derivations that could draw national attention if published. "Where did you get these?" he asked sharply. Samantha's gaze was steady. "Where he left them." "You can't keep pretending, Professor. He's not just a janitor, and you know it." Elliot slammed the folder shut, his voice low with anger. "You don't understand what you're meddling with. This isn't about equations. It's about perception, power, and order. Do you think the dean will celebrate him, or will they bury him the moment his name threatens theirs?" Samantha didn't flinch. "Maybe, but burying him doesn't make his mind less real." Elliot leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. The cracks were spreading faster than he could contain them. What began as whispers was becoming evidence. And once evidence spread, even Harvard couldn't silence it completely. The scandal was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Word reached the dean's office soon after. A discreet memo circulated, summoning Elliot for a private meeting. The language was polite, but the meaning was sharp. Explain the rumors, or watch the institution unravel. Elliot read the memo twice, his stomach sinking. He knew what awaited him. A room full of polished men and women, who thrived on control. To them, Malcolm wasn't a human being. He was a threat. And as Elliot folded the paper and slid it into his coat pocket, he realized something chilling. This was no longer about whether Malcolm Reed had solved an equation. It was about whether Harvard would allow the world to know that he had. And soon, word reached the dean's office, where admiration twisted into suspicion. The memo from the dean's office reached Elliot, before it reached Malcolm, and in that small detail lay the cruelty of Harvard's order. Decisions were always made behind closed doors first, polished in whispers and careful language, before the accused was ever summoned. Malcolm's name appeared on no official letterhead. His presence was never formally requested. Instead, a custodian supervisor, looking uncomfortable, as though carrying poison in an envelope, approached him during his shift. "They want to see you," the man muttered, not meeting Malcolm's eyes. "Who?" Malcolm asked. "The dean's office." The supervisor gave no explanation, only pointed toward a corridor Malcolm had never walked down, except to clean. Malcolm wiped his hands on his uniform and followed the echo of his own footsteps. At the end of the corridor stood a wooden door polished to a shine, brass handle gleaming. A placard read, "Dean Charles Whitmore, Office of Academic Integrity." The title itself felt like a warning. His mop bucket stood abandoned outside the door, the smell of bleach clinging to him as he knocked softly and entered. The office was small, but suffocating, walls lined with books and certificates framed in heavy oak. Behind the desk sat Dean Whitmore, a man with silver hair and the clipped diction of old Boston money. Elliot Granger sat to one side, his arms folded, his expression carefully neutral. A third professor Malcolm didn't recognize tapped a pen against a notebook. "Mr. Reed," Whitmore said, not looking up from a folder in front of him. "Do you know why you're here?" Malcolm shook his head. "No, sir." Whitmore finally lifted his gaze, steely and unblinking. "There are troubling reports circulating about you, about inappropriate use of classroom space and academic dishonesty." The words stung. Malcolm's chest tightened. "Dishonesty?" he repeated, incredulous. Elliot cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Reed, certain equations were found written on classroom boards. Complex, advanced equations. Equations well beyond the level of our undergraduates. Understandably, questions have been raised. How did they get there?" Malcolm's mouth went dry. "I wrote them." The room fell into a hush so sharp he could hear the faint tick of the dean's clock. "You expect us to believe," Whitmore said slowly, "that you, a custodian, produced these solutions?" "I didn't expect anything," Malcolm said, steady though his hands trembled. "You asked me and I answered." The third professor snorted. "Preposterous. More likely you copied them from discarded notes, or from overhearing lectures while you cleaned." "I didn't copy them," Malcolm said firmly. "I solved them." The words hung in the air, brave but fragile. Whitmore leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Do you understand the seriousness of this, Mr. Reed? Academic misconduct is not tolerated at Harvard. Passing off the work of others as your own is a grave offense. It wastes faculty time and undermines the integrity of the institution." Malcolm blinked. The absurdity hit him like a slap. They weren't even entertaining the possibility that his work was real. They had skipped straight to punishment. "I didn't pass off anything," Malcolm said, his voice rising slightly. "I don't have notes to copy from. I don't sit in your lectures. I wrote what I know." Elliot's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was a betrayal. Malcolm felt like a blade. "Whitmore scribbled something in the folder. Perhaps you don't fully appreciate your place here. You are employed as custodial staff. Nothing more. If we discover further incidents of you interfering with academic materials, there will be consequences. Do you understand me?" "Consequences," Malcolm repeated. His voice cracked, not from fear, but from the familiar sting of being diminished. Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "Yes. Termination. At the very least. You will confine yourself to your duties, mopping floors, emptying trash. That is the role you were hired for. Not this." He gestured with disdain at the equations in the file. Malcolm felt heat rising behind his eyes, a wave of humiliation threatening to drown him. The mop bucket outside the door seemed to mock him now, a reminder of the box they had built for him, the cage of expectation he had dared to escape for a moment too long. He swallowed hard. "So you'd rather call me a liar than admit the truth?" Whitmore's tone turned icy. "The truth is not written by janitors on blackboards in the dead of night. The truth comes through scholarship, through merit, through years of discipline. You cannot simply walk in from the shadows and claim it. That is not how this institution works." Malcolm's chest heaved, his composure cracking. "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly. For the first time, Whitmore's expression faltered. His lips thinned, his face flushing. "This meeting is concluded," he snapped. "Return to your duties, and let this be the last time we waste resources on such nonsense." Malcolm stood slowly, the weight of years pressing against his spine. He turned to leave, but his eyes caught Elliot's for a moment. There was no triumph there, no comfort, only guilt, tightly masked. As he stepped into the hallway, the door shut behind him with a heavy thud. He exhaled shakily, humiliation sitting like a stone in his chest. And then an unexpected sound. "Mr. Reed?" Malcolm turned. Standing a few feet down the corridor was Samantha Cole. She hadn't meant to overhear, but voices carried in these old halls. Her face was pale, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "I heard," she began, then stopped. The weight of what she'd witnessed left her struggling for words. Malcolm looked away, ashamed. "Don't worry about it. Just rumors. That's all they see me as." But Samantha shook her head fiercely. "No, that's not what I see." For the first time in days, something flickered in Malcolm's chest that wasn't despair. A glimmer. A possibility. Because while Harvard had chosen to humiliate him, someone else had just chosen to believe. Yet in that same moment of humiliation, one graduate student in the hallway overheard and decided to follow the truth. The hallway outside the dean's office was quiet, yet Malcolm felt exposed, as if every framed portrait of past deans along the wall was watching him leave in disgrace. The air was heavy with the stale weight of judgment. His hands were trembling, though not from fear. It was anger. A hollow, simmering anger that came from being silenced once again, just when he thought the truth might finally surface. Samantha Cole stood at the end of the hall, notebook clutched tight against her chest. She wasn't supposed to be there, not technically, but her curiosity and her concern had kept her rooted long enough to hear every word exchanged inside that office. She had seen Malcolm leave with his head lowered, the door clicking shut behind him like a cell door. Her instincts told her something the faculty refused to admit. Malcolm wasn't a liar. She'd seen his work before, the night she walked in on him. And Professor Granger. The elegance of those equations wasn't something you could fake. It was lived, breathed, understood in ways that transcended rote learning. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, catching up to him. Malcolm turned slightly, his expression weary, guarded. "You shouldn't be here." Samantha shook her head. "I heard everything." He stiffened. His instinct was to retreat. Decades of being dismissed had trained him not to lean on others. "Then you know what they think of me." "I know what I saw," she said firmly. "And it wasn't fraud." Her voice, steady and unshaken, startled him. Few people had ever spoken to him with that kind of conviction. He searched her eyes for a trace of pity, the kind he'd grown used to. But what he saw instead was belief. For a moment, the weight on his chest lifted. "Believing me doesn't change what they'll do," he said quietly. Samantha hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Maybe not, but hiding the truth doesn't change it either. They want you invisible. I won't let them bury this." Malcolm studied her, uncertain. He had spent years avoiding hope, knowing it often led to disappointment. Yet something about her, her bluntness, her refusal to shrink in the face of injustice, felt different. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why risk anything for me?" Samantha looked away briefly, the shadows of her own past flickering across her face. She had been dismissed too, mocked for being too emotional in her research presentations, overlooked for fellowships given to her male peers with weaker projects. She carried her own scars, though hers were subtler, hidden under layers of academic courtesy. "Because I know what it feels like to be silenced," she admitted, "and because genius deserves recognition, no matter who it comes from." Her words lodged in his chest, both sharp and healing. That night, while Malcolm returned to his shift in silence, Samantha stayed awake in her dorm, flipping through pages of equations she had retrieved from the trash weeks earlier. Crumpled sheets, filled with Malcolm's handwriting, messy yet brilliant. She spread them out on the floor like pieces of a puzzle, tracing the lines with her finger. The deeper she went, the clearer it became. These weren't copied fragments. They were original derivations. Proof. By morning, her resolve had hardened. She walked into the faculty lounge with the papers neatly organized in a folder. The room was alive with the low hum of professors murmuring over coffee, debating research grants, gossiping about colleagues. When Samantha approached the cluster of faculty, Elliot Granger among them, a hush fell. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but commanding. She set the folder on the table. "I have something you need to see." The professors exchanged glances, some amused, others irritated. Elliot's jaw tightened as he recognized the folder. Dr. Patel leaned forward curiously. "What is this?" "Proof," Samantha said. She opened the folder, spreading the equations across the table. "These were written by Malcolm Reed, the man you've been accusing of fraud. I found them discarded in the trash near one of the classrooms." Look at the structure, the derivations. These aren't copy. They're original. They're his. Silence gripped the room. Several professors leaned in, scanning the pages. Their expressions shifted. First disbelief, then recognition. The equations were sound. Not just sound, they were elegant. This is remarkable, Patel murmured. But before the air could shift toward acknowledgement, Elliot interjected. Remarkable or reckless? His voice cut sharp through the room. You're bringing us scraps from a trash bin and claiming they prove authorship. How do you know he didn't pull them from lecture notes and scribble them out? Samantha's eyes flashed. Because I've seen him work. I walked in on him solving problems your students couldn't touch. You can pretend it's not real, but I know what I saw. The lounge fell tense. Dr. Keller, the third professor from the dean's office, sneered. This is absurd. You're a doctoral candidate, Miss Cole, not an authority. Loyalty is admirable, but you're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Aligning yourself with a janitor against your own faculty? It's dangerous. It undermines your credibility. There it was, the veiled threat. Samantha's stomach twisted, but she stood her ground. My credibility doesn't matter. The truth does. A low murmur rippled across the room. Some professors exchanged skeptical looks. Others rolled their eyes. Elliot leaned back in his chair, arms folded, watching the storm unfold with a measured calm that hid his turmoil. It was Whitmore, the dean himself, who entered midway and silenced the room with his presence. He eyed the papers, then Samantha, then Elliot. His voice was smooth, deliberate. Miss Cole, he said, your passion is noted, but you should understand the damage such claims can cause. Harvard does not operate on whispers and scraps. We operate on discipline, rigor, order. Associating yourself with this nonsense could jeopardize your standing here. The words were polite, but the meaning was brutal. Choose your future, or choose the janitor. Samantha felt her face flush, but she didn't back down. Then maybe Harvard's order is the problem, she said softly, but clearly enough for every professor in the room to hear. The silence was suffocating. Elliot's eyes flicked toward her, sharp with both admiration and dread. She had just crossed a line most graduate students never dared to approach. By the time she left the lounge, the whispers had already started. This time not just about Malcolm, but about her, a graduate student defending a janitor. Foolish, naive, rebellious. Back in her dorm, Samantha sat on her bed, her hands trembling around the folder. She knew what she had done. She had placed herself in the line of fire, not just Malcolm. And Harvard did not forgive disobedience. Malcolm found her later that evening. She had slipped the folder back into her bag, but her eyes were tired, her voice subdued. They turned on you, Malcolm said quietly. She looked up at him, her expression firm despite her exhaustion. Let them. You deserve someone to stand up for you. And if it has to be me, then so be it. Malcolm swallowed hard, guilt mingling with gratitude. I don't want you to lose everything, because of me. Samantha shook her head. This isn't just about you. It's about all of us who get dismissed, overlooked, erased. They think truth belongs only to them. I'm not going to play along. For the first time, Malcolm felt something he hadn't in years. He wasn't alone. But as they sat together in that quiet room, the echoes of faculty whispers spread like cracks through the walls of Harvard. And soon, those cracks would grow into fractures neither of them could control. But when she brought evidence of Malcolm's work to the faculty, the room turned against her too, branding her loyalty as rebellion. The fallout from Samantha's defiance rippled through Harvard like a stone dropped into still water. Professors who once treated her with perfunctory politeness now eyed her warily, as though her choice to side with Malcolm had stained her reputation. Students whispered in corridors, calling her naive, reckless, or worse. Even her advisor, a woman who had once praised her diligence, now avoided meeting her eye. But Samantha didn't regret it. If anything, the hostility hardened her resolve. Truth didn't disappear just because the powerful chose to ignore it. It was during one of those long nights of doubt and determination that she stumbled upon the notes. Malcolm had been working late again, cleaning lecture halls long after students had gone. The routine helped numb the sting of humiliation after his meeting with the dean. He erased chalkboards, emptied bins, stacked chairs, but his mind was restless, humming with equations he couldn't speak aloud. He had learned to scribble them on discarded scraps, envelopes, old worksheets, even the backs of cafeteria receipts, just to silence the rhythm in his head. That night, pressed for time, He tossed a bundle of half-scribbled papers into a trash bin, thinking nothing of it. They weren't meant for anyone else's eyes. The next morning, Samantha passed through the same hall and noticed the janitor's cart still parked outside, unattended. Something tugged at her curiosity. She glanced inside the bin, and there it was, a crumpled sheet, covered in Malcolm's handwriting, dense with symbols and derivation. Her breath caught. She pulled it out, then another, then another. 5 pages in total. She smoothed them across her lap as she sat on a bench in the empty hallway. At first glance, the work was nearly incomprehensible. But as her trained eye adjusted, the patterns came alive. This wasn't just advanced mathematics. It was frontier work, problems she recognized from research seminars. Open questions that had stumped her peers for years were unraveled in front of her. Not fully solved, but advanced further than she had ever seen. Her heart raced. These weren't mimicries. They weren't stolen. The thinking was too fluid, too organic. It was Malcolm's voice written in chalk and ink. By the time she stood, the decision was made. That evening, she sought out Elliot Granger. He had been avoiding her since the confrontation in the faculty lounge, slipping out of meetings before she could catch him. But she cornered him in his office, the folder of Malcolm's notes tucked under her arm. "Professor," she said firmly, shutting the door behind her. Elliot looked up from his desk, irritation flickering in his eyes.
"Miss Cole, I've made myself clear."
"Involving yourself in this janitor business is not only unwise, it's career suicide." "This isn't business," Samantha shot back. She slapped a folder onto his desk and pushed it toward him. "This is proof." Elliot's gaze lingered on her, then reluctantly fell to the papers. He opened the folder, brow furrowing as he scanned the lines. At first his expression was dismissive, prepared to dismiss them as the scribbles of an amateur. But then he saw it. His eyes widened. His hands slowed, tracing the logic, following the leaps. A familiar problem stared back at him. A problem he himself had struggled with in conferences, one declared unsolvable within their generation. And here it was, not complete, but cracked open, advanced with terrifying clarity. Elliot's throat went dry. He flipped to the next page. Another derivation. Another impossibility reimagined. He felt his heart pound against his ribs. "This," his voice faltered. He pressed the paper closer to his face, his hands trembling slightly. "This can't be real." "It is," Samantha said, her voice steady. "He wrote it. I found them in the trash." Elliot sat back, papers still in his hands. His face was pale, his mind a storm. He had seen genius before, in flashes from students destined for fellowships and accolades. But this was different. This was raw, unpolished brilliance, the kind that could not be explained by privilege or pedigree. "You recognize it," Samantha pressed. He didn't answer, but his silence was louder than words. "This is bigger than you," she said, stepping closer. "Bigger than me. Malcolm isn't a fraud. He's extraordinary. And the longer you deny it, the more complicit you become in burying him." Elliot slammed the folder shut suddenly, as though afraid of what the pages contained. His voice was tight. "Do you have any idea what this would do to the university if it became public? A janitor solving problems our faculty can't touch. It would make us a mockery." "A mockery?" Samantha's voice cracked, incredulous. "No, it would make Harvard honest. For once." Elliot's eyes flashed. He stood, slamming his palm against the desk. "You don't understand, Miss Cole. This institution survives on perception, on the illusion that genius lives only within these walls, among those deemed worthy to enter. If the world discovers we've been sweeping brilliance into corners with a mop, it unravels everything." Samantha's heart pounded. "So you would rather protect the illusion than the truth?" Elliot's jaw tightened. Sometimes survival requires it. For a long moment, the room was filled only with the sound of their breathing. Samantha's fists clenched at her sides. "Then you're not just a coward," she said quietly. "You're complicit in erasing him." Her words hit Elliot like a slap. His face hardened, but his hands betrayed him, still shaking as they hovered over the folder. He wanted to throw it away, to burn it, to erase what he had seen. But he couldn't. The equations were carved into his mind now, undeniable. And in the privacy of that office, Elliot Granger felt something he hadn't in years. Fear. Not fear of failure, but fear of being exposed. Not as the smartest man in the room, but as someone standing in the shadow of a man the world refused to see. "Leave," he muttered finally, his voice strained. Samantha's eyes narrowed. You know I'm right. Leave, he snapped, louder this time. She hesitated, then picked up her bag and walked out, the echo of her footsteps sharp against the stone floor. Elliot sank back into his chair, the folder still in front of him. His fingers brushed the edges of the pages. His mind churned, his body taut with conflict. He had two choices. He could champion Malcolm Reed, risk scandal, and shatter the myth Harvard thrived on. Or he could bury him forever, take the work as his own, and let the institution rest comfortably on its fragile hierarchy. His hands trembled as he pressed the papers to his chest, his heart pounding with the unbearable weight of the truth. Elliot faced the truth. Either champion Malcolm's mind, or bury it forever. The folder never left Elliot's desk. He tried to bury it under lecture notes, hide it beneath administrative papers, but the equations bled through everything else, refusing to be silenced. And while Elliot wrestled with his own conscience in secret, Harvard wrestled with the whispers of scandal in the open. Malcolm's name began to drift through the campus, not spoken with reverence, but with ridicule. The janitor mathematician, they called him in hushed tones. A joke, a punchline. Students who had never spoken his name before now laughed about him in dining halls. I heard he thinks he's smarter than the professors, one sophomore snickered, balancing a tray of food. Another smirked. What's next? The landscaper rewriting biology textbooks? Laughter rippled, sharp and cutting. Malcolm overheard them once while collecting trash near the cafeteria. Their words weren't meant for him, but they found him anyway, seeping into his bones like cold. He tightened his grip on the trash bag and kept walking, the weight heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the students. Faculty too indulged in subtle dismissal. At seminars, when the rumors arose, they scoffed. An amusing story, one professor chuckled. But let's be serious, our field doesn't advance on fairy tales. Even those who suspected the truth clung to the safety of denial. Admitting Malcolm's genius would mean admitting the system had failed to see him, to nurture him, to give him space. That was too heavy a truth for Harvard to carry. For Malcolm, the ridicule was suffocating. His name was on everyone's lips, yet never in the way he had dreamed. He was talked about more than ever, but not as a mathematician, as an oddity, as an intrusion into their order. One evening, while sweeping an empty lecture hall, he found a note taped to the board. In sloppy handwriting, it read, "Stick to the floors." Malcolm crumpled it in his fist, his jaw clenched. He tossed it into the trash but couldn't shake the sting. Later that week, as he polished the floors near the library, a pair of undergraduates passed by, not realizing he could hear them. "Imagine thinking anyone would ever publish his work," one scoffed. The other laughed. "Please. Even if it's good, no one cares where it came from. He'll die with it on scraps of paper, and the world won't know the difference." The words echoed. Die with it on scraps of paper. He went home that night with chalk dust still on his hands, staring at the small apartment walls as if they were closing in. He had been dismissed his whole life, but now it felt worse. Because they knew, they had seen, and still, they refused. It was Samantha who noticed the change in him. She found him sitting alone in an empty classroom, long after his shift had ended, staring at a blank board. "You haven't written anything," she said softly. Malcolm didn't look at her. "What's the point?" Her heart clenched. "The point is it's yours. They don't get to take that from you." He let out a hollow laugh. "Don't they? They already have. I'm a janitor, Samantha. I push a mop, and they push me aside. I solve problems that shake their foundations, and still I'm nothing more than a joke to them." She stepped closer, her voice firm. "You're not a joke. You're the only one in this building who's telling the truth, and they're terrified of it." Malcolm finally looked up at her. In her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen anywhere else at Harvard. Defiance on his behalf. It was a fragile lifeline, but it was enough to steady him for now. Still, the ridicule grew. Students left chalk caricatures of him on boards, stick figures with mops and math symbols. Professors made sly remarks during lectures. "Perhaps our custodian would like to attempt this proof." Laughter followed, echoing through the halls. Harvard thrived on prestige, and prestige thrived on cruelty when threatened. Malcolm had become the target of their collective defense mechanism. But then, an unexpected twist. A letter arrived in Elliot Granger's mailbox. Heavy parchment, the kind reserved for serious correspondence. The return address was unmistakable, the Journal of Theoretical Mathematics. Elliot froze as he read the opening lines. We have recently heard reports of remarkable derivations connected to your department. The rumors suggest new approaches to long-standing unsolved problems. If these claims are true, we would be honored to review the work for possible publication under your name. Elliot's breath caught. His hands trembled as he gripped the letter. The world outside Harvard had begun to listen. Not to Malcolm, but to him. The whispers had escaped the ivory walls, reshaped into an opportunity for Elliot himself. The irony cut sharp. Malcolm, mocked as the janitor mathematician, had never been closer to recognition. But the recognition wasn't his. It was being delivered, neatly packaged, to the professor who had the power to claim it. Elliot stared at the letter for a long time, his reflection shimmering faintly in the glass of his office window. His heart pounded, not with pride, but with dread, because the choice was upon him again, sharper than ever. Would he let Malcolm's name remain a joke, while taking the glory for himself? Or would he risk everything, his reputation, his colleagues' respect, Harvard's pristine facade, to tell the truth? Until one day, a prestigious mathematics journal reached out, not to Malcolm, but to Elliot. The letter from the Journal of Theoretical Mathematics lay on Elliot Granger's desk like a weapon. Its parchment was thick, its typeface formal, its invitation polished and deliberate. Submit the equations, and the journal would consider them under his name. For a long time, Elliot simply stared at it. His office, usually a sanctuary of control, neatly stacked books, meticulously arranged papers, now felt like a courtroom. The walls seemed to lean closer, demanding a verdict. The temptation was suffocating. If he signed his name, no one would question it. A professor of his standing, publishing groundbreaking solutions, would only elevate Harvard further. The whispers about a janitor would dissolve into laughter, remembered as a silly rumor. The equations would belong to the institution, to Elliot, and the world would move on. But the thought of Malcolm Reed hunched quietly over a board, chalk dust clinging to his hands, eyes alive with something purer than ambition, that haunted him. Malcolm hadn't sought fame or credit. He hadn't demanded recognition. He had simply written what he knew, leaving truth scattered like crumbs no one wanted to pick up. Elliot poured himself a drink, the amber liquid trembling in the glass. He told himself he had earned this. He had worked decades for his position, endured the pressure of Harvard's unrelenting hierarchy. Didn't he deserve to be the face of something extraordinary? But beneath that justification was fear. Fear that if he admitted Malcolm's genius, the entire architecture of Harvard's prestige would crack. Because if brilliance could bloom in a janitor's uniform, then what did that say about all the gatekeepers who had kept the doors shut? He took a long drink, but the taste was bitter. The next morning, Samantha found him in his office, the letter half buried under a pile of papers. She caught the glint of the journal's crest before he shoved it aside. "What's that?" she asked. "Nothing you need to worry about," Elliot muttered. His tone clipped. Samantha's eyes narrowed. "The journal reached out, didn't they?" He didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Her jaw tightened. "You're considering it." Elliot leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Do you know what's at stake here, Miss Cole? This isn't about a paper. It's about the credibility of an entire institution. If the world believes a janitor solved problems that stumped Harvard's finest, what do you think happens next? Grants dry up, donors pull back, the school becomes a punchline. Or, Samantha countered sharply, the world finally sees that genius isn't about last names and legacies. Maybe the punchline isn't Harvard, it's the prejudice that blinded you all." Her words landed hard. Elliot looked away, guilt flickering across his features. "You're young," he said finally, his voice weary. "You don't understand the machinery behind this place. It's not just about truth, it's about survival." Samantha stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. "Then maybe it's time Harvard stopped surviving on lies." For a long moment, their eyes locked. And for the first time, Elliot saw not just a student, but an adversary, someone unwilling to let him hide. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. He saw Malcolm everywhere, in the quiet dignity of his posture, in the restraint of his voice, when accused, in the lonely defiance of a man who had no armor except truth. The ridicule Malcolm endured echoed in his ears. Stick to the floors, the janitor mathematician. But what haunted Elliot most wasn't the ridicule. It was the possibility that history would repeat itself, erasing Malcolm's genius the way it had erased countless others before him. By dawn, his decision was made. The next week, at a packed departmental colloquium, Elliot walked onto the stage with a folder in hand. Professors, graduate students, and undergraduates filled the lecture hall, the air buzzing with rumor. Everyone knew something was coming. The whispers about Malcolm had reached a fever pitch. Some expected Elliot to crush them once and for all. Others hoped for spectacle. Samantha sat near the back, her stomach in knots. Malcolm wasn't in the room. He had been warned not to attend, but his absence felt louder than his presence. Elliot adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. I've been asked more than once in recent weeks about certain rumors circulating regarding this department. Rumors that a member of our custodial staff has been implicated in advanced mathematical work. Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and dismissive. Elliot paused, letting the noise die down. Then he held up the folder. I will tell you now, those rumors are not only true, they are not nearly enough. The room froze. Gasps. Murmurs. A ripple of confusion spread. Samantha leaned forward, her breath caught. Elliot opened the folder and laid out the pages, Malcolm's pages, on the projector. Equations lit up the screen. Lines of brilliance filled the room, undeniable in their elegance. This work, Elliot said, his voice steady but taut, was not produced by me, nor by any of you. It was produced by Malcolm Reed, a man whose brilliance we have overlooked because of the role he occupies here. The silence was suffocating. Professors shifted uncomfortably. Students stared, wide-eyed. Samantha felt her chest swell with both relief and dread. And then the backlash began. Dr. Keller scoffed loudly from the front row. Are we to believe this? That a janitor has outperformed our PhD candidates? This is a circus, Granger. You've humiliated yourself. Others nodded, muttering, their faces twisted with disbelief. The room became a storm of indignation. Samantha stood suddenly, her voice cutting through the din. It's not humiliation. It's the truth, and you're angry not because it isn't real, but because it is. All eyes turned to her. For a moment, she stood alone, the target of both admiration and scorn. Elliot raised a hand, quieting the chaos. I will not pretend this revelation is comfortable. It is not. But comfort has never been the measure of truth. He gestured to the board, the equations glowing behind him. What you see here is undeniable, and the question now is not whether it is real. It is whether we will acknowledge the man behind it. The lecture hall erupted again, louder this time. Students shouted over professors, lines drawn instantly in the sand. Some cheered Malcolm's name. Others jeered, mocking, outraged. In the chaos, Samantha caught Elliot's eye. For the first time she saw something unguarded in him. Not arrogance, not fear, but liberation. He had chosen the truth, and now there was no turning back. But outside the lecture hall, news traveled fast. By the end of the night, the campus was ablaze with controversy. Some hailed Malcolm as proof that genius could not be contained by status. Others smeared him as a fraud, accusing Elliot of being duped or manipulated. And in the dean's office, Charles Whitmore received a call from the board of trustees. Their message was clear: Harvard's order was under attack, and someone would pay the price. Elliot made a choice that would ignite the entire campus. The days following Elliot Granger's revelation were a blur of noise. Harvard's campus pulsed with argument, its quiet lawns and stately lecture halls vibrating with conflict. Students debated in cafeterias, professors clashed in lounges, alumni called the administration demanding answers. For the first time, the name Malcolm Reed was everywhere, not whispered in ridicule, but spoken with urgency, with weight. The dean's office, pressured from trustees and donors alike, devised a plan. If they couldn't silence the controversy, they would control it. And so, a notice went out across campus. A special lecture, showcasing revolutionary mathematical work, would be held in Sanders Theater. Faculty, students, and select guests were invited to attend. To Malcolm, the invitation never came. Instead, Samantha slipped the news to him one evening, breathless from running. They're presenting your work, she said, clutching the flyer. But they haven't told you. I think they're trying to erase you again. Malcolm read the announcement, his stomach hollowing. The date, the time, the title, Mathematical Breakthroughs in Modern Theory, presented by Professor Elliot Granger. His chest tightened. So they've decided, he murmured. Samantha's eyes burned. Then we won't let them. You'll be there, even if they don't want you to. The night of the lecture, Sanders Theater gleamed under golden lights. Rows upon rows of seats filled with students, faculty, and even journalists from local papers. The buzz in the air was electric, anticipation thick with curiosity and controversy. Malcolm entered quietly, unnoticed at first. He wore the same uniform he always did, freshly laundered but unmistakably the garb of staff. He slipped into a seat near the back, his presence blending into the shadows. On stage, Dean Charles Whitmore adjusted the microphone, his voice polished and commanding. "Harvard has always been a beacon of knowledge," he began, his tone rich with practiced pride. "Tonight we celebrate a remarkable advancement in mathematics, work that challenges what we believed possible." Malcolm's heart thudded. The dean's words should have been his moment. Recognition, acknowledgement. But he knew better than to trust the promise of an institution that had already silenced him once. "And it is my honor," Whitmore continued, smiling faintly, "to introduce the mind behind this achievement, Professor Elliot Granger." The applause was immediate, thundering. Students rose to their feet. Faculty nodded with approval. Malcolm sat frozen in the back row, his chest hollow, his throat dry. The name echoed like a verdict. Elliot Granger. Not his. Never his. On stage, Elliot stepped to the podium, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He looked out over the sea of faces, the applause swelling. He had chosen the truth once before, but tonight, the dean had chosen for him. The program bore his name. The audience expected his performance, and the institution demanded his silence. His hands gripped the lectern, knuckles white. Behind him, the screen glowed with Malcolm's equations, projected larger than life, lines of brilliance, born in a janitor's stolen moments, now displayed under someone else's name. From the back, Malcolm stared at the screen, his chest rising and falling with sharp, uneven breaths, his life's hidden language, stripped of his identity. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Decades of dismissal had taught him the futility of protest. He simply sat, silent, as the room cheered another man for his genius. But not everyone stayed silent. Samantha, seated near the aisle, felt her blood boil. Her nails dug into her palms as she watched Elliot's lips move, words that weren't his spilling into the microphone. She saw Malcolm in the shadows, his pain written in the lines of his face, his silence heavier than the theater itself, and she snapped. Standing abruptly, she raised her voice, cutting through the lecture like a blade. "Stop lying." The room stilled. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. All eyes swung toward her, a lone graduate student standing against a sea of tradition. "That work," Samantha's voice shook but grew steadier with each word, "doesn't belong to Professor Granger. It belongs to him." She turned, pointing toward the back row. Her finger locked on Malcolm Reed, who sat stunned, caught in the spotlight of truth he never asked for. Gasps echoed. Murmurs surged. Students twisted in their seats to look at the man in the janitor's uniform. Malcolm froze, his heart pounding. For a moment, shame told him to flee, to disappear into the shadows as he always had. But Samantha's voice, sharp, unyielding, anchored him in place. "Tell them, Professor," she demanded, her voice rising. "Tell them the truth. Tell them whose mind solved those equations." The theater erupted into chaos, voices shouting, professors rising to object, students demanding answers. Elliot stood frozen at the podium, caught between two worlds. His career, his reputation, the institution that had made him all demanded silence. But the truth, raw and undeniable, demanded something else. Malcolm sat in the back row, every eye on him, every prejudice sharpened like a blade. The moment he had feared his whole life had arrived. Not recognition, but exposure. And now, everything hung on what Elliot would do next. Until Samantha stood, pointing directly at Malcolm, shattering the silence with one undeniable truth. The theater erupted like a dam breaking. Samantha's words cut through the carefully orchestrated performance, and suddenly there was no holding back the flood. Students twisted in their seats to see Malcolm, whispers swelling into shouts. Some faces glowed with excitement, others curled with disgust. "It's him? The janitor?" One student scoffed. Another, braver, called out, "If he did the work, give him the credit." The mix of voices tangled into chaos. The lecture hall, built for orderly knowledge, became a battlefield of privilege and possibility. Dean Whitmore rose sharply from his front row seat, his hand raised for order. "Enough," he barked, his voice booming through the microphone. "Sit down, Miss Cole. This is neither the time nor the place for—" But the crowd drowned him out. "Let him speak," a student shouted. He doesn't belong here, another countered. The clash was electric, every prejudice and every hope colliding in one room. On stage, Elliot stood at the podium, paralyzed. Sweat beaded on his brow. He looked from Samantha standing firm in the aisle, to Malcolm, still seated in the shadows, the theater's gaze burning into him. Malcolm's chest rose and fell heavily. His entire life had been spent dodging this moment, avoiding the spotlight that came only to expose, never to celebrate. Now it had found him, mercilessly. Whitmore slammed his hand on the armrest, his face red with fury. "This farce ends now," he declared. "Professor Granger is the recognized scholar here. We will not indulge baseless theatrics." But Samantha's voice rang out again, sharper, stronger. "Baseless? Look at the equations. You all know this work isn't Elliot Granger's. It doesn't bear his voice. It's Malcolm's. And you know it." Gasps rippled through the faculty section. Her audacity was unthinkable, yet undeniable. A professor in the back stood and sneered. "Preposterous. A custodian solving equations that stump doctoral candidates. This is delusion, not discovery." But a student countered. "Why not? Maybe you're just jealous he saw what you couldn't." Laughter and outrage clashed. In the back row, Malcolm's hands trembled against his knees. His name had become a weapon again, thrown around the hall like a curse or a prayer. Every insult cut deep, but every defense lit a spark. The battle wasn't just about him anymore. It was about whether the walls of Harvard could contain the truth. Elliot finally spoke, his voice cutting into the storm. "Enough." The hall hushed. Though tension still simmered, he turned toward Malcolm, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Reed, will you come forward?" All eyes shifted. Malcolm froze, his heart hammering. 1,000 thoughts collided. Humiliation, fear, the memory of being called a liar in the dean's office. But also Samantha's voice, clear as a bell. "They're terrified because it's real." He stood slowly, his janitor's uniform stark against the sea of blazers and polished shoes. Whispers swelled as he walked down the aisle. Every step heavy, every gaze ablaze. "Sit down," one professor hissed. "Let him try," a student shouted back. By the time Malcolm reached the stage, the theater was vibrating with expectation. Dean Whitmore leaned toward the microphone, his face sharp with disdain. "This is highly irregular. You are not authorized to." But Elliot cut him off. "He doesn't need authorization. He needs a blackboard." Whitmore's face darkened, but the theater roared with approval. Malcolm approached the board, the chalk tray waiting like a challenge. He picked up a piece, his fingers coated in white dust once again. For the first time, the silence was his. But before he could move, a voice pierced the quiet. "You think writing symbols on a board proves anything?" Dr. Keller sneered, rising from his seat. "This is theater, nothing more. We demand rigor, not tricks." The insult echoed. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He turned his head slightly, his voice calm, steady. "Then give me your hardest question. And watch." The theater erupted in gasps. Keller faltered, his face flushing. "This is absurd." But Samantha's voice rang out, fierce and defiant. "No, it's justice." The hall leaned forward as Keller scribbled a problem on a sheet of paper and handed it up. A notoriously difficult theorem, one whispered about in graduate circles, thought to be unapproachable without years of specialized research. Elliot glanced at it, his heart skipping. He had seen the problem before, wrestled with it himself, and failed. Malcolm scanned it once, twice. His brow furrowed, not from confusion, but from concentration. The symbols began to align in his mind, threads weaving into patterns. He turned to the board, the chalk touched, and silence fell like a curtain. Every stroke was deliberate, measured, flowing with a rhythm that mesmerized the crowd. His posture shifted from tentative to assured, his voice silent but his mind speaking in chalk. Minutes passed. Keller's smirk faded. Whitmore's face tightened. Students leaned forward in awe. Samantha's eyes burned with pride. When Malcolm stepped back at last, the board was alive with a solution so clean it drew audible gasps. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. And then it broke. Some students cheered, clapping wildly. Others booed, shouting that it was a trick. Faculty argued loudly, voices colliding in disbelief or reluctant admiration. The theater dissolved into uproar, a storm of clashing worlds, but Malcolm didn't hear them. His focus remained on the board, the chalk still warm in his hand. For the first time, he wasn't erasing equations. He was writing history, And in the chaos, Malcolm walked to the chalkboard, his hand steady, ready to prove himself once again. The theater air was electric, trembling with the weight of disbelief. Malcolm Reed stood before the massive chalkboard, chalk dust clinging to his hands like evidence of a crime and a miracle at once. The room was divided, half a storm of ridicule, half an eruption of awe, but the silence that followed his solution was undeniable. For the first time in his life, Malcolm was not hidden in the shadows. All eyes were fixed on him. "Check the work," a student shouted from the balcony. Dr. Keller stormed forward, snatching the chalkboard eraser from the tray, and scanning Malcolm's lines, as though desperate to find a flaw. His finger traced each symbol, each leap of logic. The further he went, the tighter his jaw became. By the final line, his face was pale. He faltered, his voice cracking. "It's correct." Gasps surged through the theater. Applause erupted in pockets, students rising to their feet, clapping wildly. But others hissed, muttered, folded their arms in defiance. Dean Whitmore stood rigid in the front row, his expression unreadable. His silence was louder than any protest. Malcolm's chest rose and fell steadily, but his hands shook now, not from uncertainty, but from the sheer force of the moment. He had lived a lifetime of erasure, told endlessly that brilliance couldn't live in his skin, his uniform, his world, and here in front of the gatekeepers of Harvard, he had written proof that no denial could erase. Samantha leapt from her seat, her voice strong and unyielding. "You see it now. You all see it. He's not a fraud. He's not a rumor. He's the mathematician you tried to bury." The crowd swelled again. Cheers, jeers, arguments colliding like thunder. Elliot, still frozen at the podium, stared at Malcolm. Something inside him cracked, something he had buried under pride and fear. He knew now what he had always known, but never wanted to face. The man before him wasn't just a janitor who stumbled onto brilliance. He was a genius who had been denied his rightful place for decades. And Elliot felt both admiration and shame. In the audience, phones appeared, screens glowing as students recorded, live-streamed, capturing Malcolm at the board. The moment spread instantly beyond the theater walls, into dormitories, across campus, and soon into the world outside. Social media lit up. Harvard janitor proves himself a genius live on stage. This man solved what professors couldn't. Brilliance can't be mopped away. Within hours, Malcolm's name was trending far beyond Cambridge. But inside Sanders Theater, the storm had only just begun. Dean Whitmore finally rose, raising his hands for silence. His voice was cold, controlled. "This demonstration is not the triumph some of you believe. It is a breach of order. Harvard is not a stage for spectacle. It is an institution built on discipline, on structure, on authority. Mr. Reed is not a member of our faculty, nor a student. He is staff. He had no authorization to perform here tonight." Boos erupted from the students, but faculty nodded grimly, relief washing their faces, as the dean reasserted control. "Order must be preserved," Whitmore continued, his tone steely. "Harvard will not allow itself to be undermined by sensationalism. What happened tonight was an unfortunate indulgence, one that will not be repeated." Malcolm's stomach dropped. Even here, after proving himself in front of hundreds, they still reached for dismissal. A student shouted from the crowd, "You can't erase what we saw." Whitmore's gaze turned icy. "What you saw was disruption, not scholarship. Let this be clear. Harvard decides who belongs, and who does not." The words pierced Malcolm deeper than any insult had before. It was no longer ridicule. It was exile. But Samantha stood again, refusing silence. "You can't decide truth. You can bury it, but you can't kill it. And the world is watching now." Indeed, outside the theater, live streams had already gone viral. Thousands of viewers, then tens of thousands, then millions, watched a man in a janitor's uniform solve equations that silenced Harvard professors. Comments poured in, some praising him, others mocking, but all undeniable. Malcolm Reed had been seen. Elliot's hands trembled as he gripped the podium. He wanted to speak, to defend Malcolm, but the weight of decades of complicity pressed his voice down. His shame was a chain he couldn't yet break. Malcolm remained silent, his gaze on the board. His chalk-smeared hands trembled at his sides. He thought of every classroom he had cleaned, every night he had stolen moments to write on boards that weren't his, every time he had been told stick to the floors. And still, even after proving himself, they tried to cage him. Samantha's words rang in his ears. "The world is watching now." And it was true. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. The applause began again, not scattered, not uncertain, but thunderous. Students stomped their feet, chanted his name, turned their phones toward him. Malcolm, Malcolm, Malcolm. The sound shook the theater walls. But just as Malcolm allowed himself the faintest breath of relief, the dean's voice cut through, sharp and final. Effective immediately, Whitmore announced coldly. Malcolm Reed's employment with Harvard University is terminated. Security will escort him from campus. The theater erupted into chaos once more. Outrage, disbelief, fury colliding like fire. Samantha gasped, her face pale with shock. Elliot's chest constricted. Malcolm stood motionless, the chant of his name colliding with the sentence that sought to erase him once again. But just as the applause began, Harvard's administration announced a devastating decision. The thunder of applause had barely died down when Dean Whitmore's voice struck like a gavel. Effective immediately, Malcolm Reed's employment with Harvard University is terminated. The theater dissolved into uproar, students shouting, faculty murmuring, Samantha screaming in disbelief. Malcolm stood still, absorbing the weight of those words. He had known humiliation, had lived it for decades, but hearing it declared in front of hundreds, just moments after proving himself, cut deeper than anything before. Security officers appeared at the edge of the stage, hesitant but present, as if the dean's command were law itself. But then something unexpected happened. The students surged forward, not violently, but defiantly. They surrounded Malcolm, their chants rising again. Malcolm, Malcolm, Malcolm. Phones flashed. Social media streamed the chaos live. Within minutes, Malcolm Reed trended worldwide. The dean's order had backfired. Harvard hadn't buried Malcolm, they had exposed themselves. Still, Malcolm left quietly that night. He walked out under the watchful glare of Whitmore and the silent guilt of Elliot, his footsteps echoing through Harvard's stone halls one last time. Samantha followed him into the cold snow crunching beneath their shoes. "They can't do this," she said fiercely, tears in her voice. "They can't just erase you again." Malcolm stopped under a lamppost, his breath clouding in the night air. "They already have," he murmured. "But maybe I don't need them anymore." Samantha grabbed his arm. "Don't say that. You belong here. You've always belonged here." He looked at her then, his eyes heavy with years of silence. "Belonging isn't the same as being tolerated. They're offering me scraps, Samantha. A seat at a table where I'll never be equal." The next day, the offer came. It wasn't from Whitmore directly, but from the administration, polished, professional, calculated. Malcolm was summoned to a private meeting in a conference room that smelled of leather and old wood. Elliot was there, looking restless, avoiding his eyes. "Mr. Reed," an administrator began, her tone smooth, rehearsed. "In light of recent events, Harvard would like to offer you a formal position. Not as faculty, of course, but as a research assistant under Professor Granger's supervision. You would have access to resources, labs, and funding. A chance to contribute in a meaningful way." Her smile was thin, corporate. The words dripped with condescension. "Not as faculty, of course." Malcolm sat silently, his hands folded. His entire life he had dreamed of this building, recognizing him, not as a ghost with a mop, but as a mind. And now, after all the humiliation, they dangled recognition before him. But it was poisoned. A role beneath a role, a title stripped of dignity. Elliot finally spoke, his voice low. "It's something, Malcolm, more than they've ever offered before. If you take it, you can still do the work. Maybe it's a start." Malcolm looked at him, his gaze steady. "A start? Or a leash?" Elliot's eyes faltered. Samantha wasn't present, but Malcolm could almost hear her voice. "They're terrified because it's real." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, would a white man with my work be offered the same?" The room went still. No one answered. Malcolm stood slowly. "Then what you're offering me isn't recognition. It's containment." The administrator's mask cracked. "Mr. Reed, I urge you to consider this carefully. You'll be dismissed entirely otherwise. This is the only way to remain a part of Harvard." Malcolm's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, bitter but certain. "Maybe that's the problem. I don't want to remain a part of Harvard." The words struck like a bomb. Elliot's head shot up. Disbelief etched across his face. The administrator blinked, stunned. "You're refusing?" she asked. "Yes," Malcolm said simply. His voice was calm, even. "I spent half my life cleaning this place, dreaming of being seen. Now I see it clearly. You don't want me here. You want to own me. He turned and walked out, leaving the offer and the chains behind. Outside, Samantha waited, pacing anxiously. She looked up when she saw his face. Well? He shook his head. I said no. Her mouth fell open. No? Malcolm, that was your chance. Resources. Support. He stopped her gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a chance. It was a cage. They wanted me under Elliot's name, under their control still beneath them. If I accepted, I'd prove them right, that my place is whatever scraps they choose to hand me. Samantha's throat tightened. Then what will you do? For the first time, Malcolm's eyes carried not defeat, but fire. I'll do it myself. My work doesn't need their walls to be real. And maybe it's time the world learns that genius doesn't come stamped with Harvard's approval. The snow swirled around them, the campus glowing in the distance. But Malcolm walked away from it, each step heavy yet free. Samantha followed, her faith in him unshaken. The world outside Harvard was already watching. News outlets were replaying the viral footage. Social media dissected every second of his chalkboard demonstration. Invitations began trickling in, not from Harvard, but from activists, independent scholars, even journalists. People wanted to hear his story. For the first time, Malcolm Reed wasn't invisible. Yet Malcolm refused, choosing a path no one expected. The snow of Cambridge had long melted into seasons of change. Years had passed since Malcolm Reed walked out of Harvard's gates for the last time, refusing their offer to remain chained beneath their authority. What had seemed in that moment like the end of his dream became instead the beginning of his legacy. At first, his life beyond Harvard was difficult. The institution had not just dismissed him, it had branded him. The official statement from the administration called him an unqualified individual who disrupted academic proceedings. Newspapers sympathetic to Harvard repeated the phrase. To the wider academic community, Malcolm was either a folk hero or a fraud. But truth, unlike rumor, has a way of enduring. The viral footage of Malcolm's chalkboard solution could not be erased. Students who had been in the theater that night carried their stories everywhere. Social media preserved every stroke of chalk, every gasp of disbelief. The footage was replayed in classrooms across the world, debated in forums, dissected by mathematicians who had no stake in Harvard's pride. And slowly, reluctantly, the world began to acknowledge what Harvard tried to bury. Malcolm Reed was the real thing. Independent mathematicians published papers verifying the breakthroughs he had scrawled that night. A group of professors from MIT, furious at Harvard's silence, reached out to Malcolm privately. They asked for his notes, not to steal, not to contain, but to understand. For the first time, Malcolm was treated as a peer. Samantha Cole never left his side. She carried his papers into rooms that would have otherwise slammed their doors in his face. She fought to archive his work, to build an irrefutable record of his authorship. One day she told him, "They won't be able to tell the story of mathematics without your name." And Elliot Granger, guilt-ridden, broken by his silence and his complicity, finally chose redemption. It didn't happen overnight. For months, he hid, avoiding interviews, dodging questions. But one evening, years after Malcolm had walked away, Elliot stepped onto a stage at a mathematics conference and told the truth. Those equations were not mine, he confessed to a stunned audience. They were the work of Malcolm Reed, a man Harvard dismissed, a man I failed to defend. If history is to be honest, his name must be written in the place of mine. The recording of that speech went viral, echoing the footage of Malcolm at the chalkboard years earlier. This time, the narrative shifted. With both Samantha and Elliot standing as witnesses, the tide turned irreversibly. And then it happened. Textbooks began to change. At first it was a single edition of an advanced mathematics text, a small footnote acknowledging Malcolm Reed's contribution to a once unsolved problem. Then another, larger acknowledgement, in a widely read journal. Then at last his name appeared as it always should have, in bold attached to the equations that had lived in his mind long before anyone gave him permission to write them. The Reed solution. Students across the world learned it by name. Professors taught it in lectures. For them, Malcolm was no longer a janitor, no longer a rumor. He was a mathematician whose ideas could not be erased. Harvard, humiliated, tried to rewrite the story in its own favor, claiming it had fostered Malcolm's genius. But the truth was too widespread now, the record too loud. Everyone knew the reality. Harvard had tried to bury him. and the world had dug him back out. Malcolm never returned to lecture in its halls. He never accepted their belated offers of honorary titles or symbolic recognition. "I don't need their stage," he told Samantha once, his voice steady. "The work speaks louder than their approval ever could." Instead, he lived simply, quietly, continuing to write equations on boards in community centers, in libraries, sometimes even in the corner of his own small apartment. Children from his neighborhood came to watch him, some sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide as he explained patterns with chalk in hand. To them, he wasn't a janitor or a professor. He was Malcolm, the man who made numbers sing. And in the end, that was his greatest triumph. Years later, a student in Brazil, flipping through a textbook, paused at a chapter heading, "The Reed Solution." She didn't know the full story. She didn't know about Harvard's betrayal, the humiliation, the silence. She only knew that the work was brilliant, and that the name beneath it belonged to a black mathematician who had once been invisible. The echoes spread, generation by generation. Malcolm Reed became not just a figure of mathematics but a question mark hanging over every institution, every gatekeeper who claimed to know what genius should look like. Samantha, now a professor herself, would sometimes pause at the end of a lecture and think of that night in Sanders Theater. The roar of students, the silence of faculty, the weight of a man finally refusing invisibility. And Elliot, older, grayer, would sit in his office surrounded by chalkboards filled with Malcolm's theorems, a reminder of the brilliance he had nearly erased. His shame never faded, but neither did his duty, to speak Malcolm's name, every time someone tried to forget it. As for Malcolm himself, he remained what he had always been, not a man seeking applause, but a man compelled by truth. He never chased titles. He never demanded monuments. He only asked the question that his life embodied: what if the world had seen me sooner? And so his legacy lived on. Not in the halls of Harvard, but in the chalk dust of classrooms worldwide. Not in the praise of the powerful, but in the wonder of students who saw his name and knew without question that genius could bloom anywhere, because the truth could no longer be contained. How many other geniuses have been erased, simply because no one bothered to see them? Stories like Malcolm's aren't fiction. They happen every day, though most never make the headlines. If you believe no mind should ever be erased because of skin color or status, let your voice be heard. Type yes if you believe in justice, and subscribe if this story broke your heart.